On July 6, 1935, in the Qinghai province of China, Lama Thondup, a boy who would change history forever, was born. In 1937, the Oracle of Lhasa, Tibet, who was the person who had prophetically found most of the Dalai Lamas before, told the people who were looking for the 14th Dalai Lama that he would be found in the Qinghai province of China. Lama Thondup was one of the last boys they tested, which they did by showing him objects of the 13th Dalai Lama and some normal objects, and seeing if he could identify the ones that were the 13th Dalai Lamas. He did this successfully, but he wasn't crowned as the 14th Dalai Lama until 3 years later, when he was 5, and he changed his name to Jamphel Ngawang Lobsang Tenzin Gyatso, or just Tenzin Gyatso, because all of the Dalai Lamas changed their names so that their names become more spiritual and meaningful to Tibet. Tenzin moved in with his family to the Potala Palace in Lhasa, Tibet, the palace of the Dalai Lama, where every Dalai Lama had lived in the past, that same year. Usually, the Dalai Lamas take on their full role at 20 years old, which would mean 1955 for Tenzin. But instead, with Chinese threatening to invade their country, the people asked him to do it earlier, so he ended up taking it on in 1950, at 15 years old. A year later, the Chinese lived up to their threat and invaded Tibet for its crops and land that China didn't have. Eventually, he was forced into exile by the Chinese. While in exile, he tried his best to make peace with China by coming up with ideas where he could come back to Lhasa and rule over Tibet again. In 1952, he returned to Lhasa, even with the Chinese still there. In 1956, despite the challenges of China's invasion, he went to India to celebrate 2,500 years of the Buddha's enlightenment, which was when the Buddha was enlightened with the knowledge and beliefs that shaped the peaceful and non-violent beliefs of Buddhism. Once Tenzin returned to Tibet, rumors spread of Chinese trying to kidnap him. On March 10, 1959, many Tibetans were surrounding the Potala Palace to keep anyone who wanted to come in, out, and anyone who wanted to come out, in, because of the threats he had been receiving from the Chinese. On the 17th, he escaped from the Potala Palace with about 100 followers, most of them friends or family, by dressing as a Tibetan soldier. When they realized he was gone, he went into exile again. He and his followers settled in the Himalayas, India, because the Indians were kind enough to welcome him. Soon after, China won their attempted revolution and stripped him from his title as the ruler of Tibet. While he was in India, he created a government in exile that he was elected president of. In exile, he wrote a book about Tibetan Buddhism so it could help change the way the rest of the world looked at him. He also wrote an autobiography so that people who didn't know his life story and how much he had been through with China could hear about his life from his own perspective. Then, in 1973, he went on his first trip to Europe to talk to the leaders of Europe about his life and all that he had been through. Then, in 1979, he did the same thing but in the United States. Over the course of many years, he traveled many places around the world to talk to world leaders about his life story and Tibetan Buddhism. Later, with Tibet still under Chinese rule, he came up with the idea that Tibet would be under their own rule, but they would still partly be in China. When China heard of this idea, they refused. Because of his attempts to make peace with China, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize by the Norwegian Nobel Committee. Over the course of many years after, he wrote more books about Tibetan Buddhism. In 2005, when he had started to approach 70, the question of who his successor would be was repeatedly raised, and Tenzin at first answered by saying that his successor would be found in exile with him. Later, when Chinese started to think about finding their own Chinese Dalai Lama, the 15th Dalai Lama, who would be the ruler of Tibet, Tenzin said that he might appoint his successor to the role once he died. In 2011, he stepped down as the president of the government in exile, and in 2012, he was awarded the Templeton Prize by John Templeton Jr., which is a prize given to people who made achievements that were examples of why we're all alive and what we can do in the world, for his fights against the Chinese for taking over Tibet. Today, the Dalai Lama is living in exile in India with many of his friends and family members, protesting against Chinese rule and trying to come up with plans that make both the Chinese and Tibet prosperous. The Dalai Lama taught that being peaceful and understanding of others is more efficient than only trying to see your side of the story, which I think is a very good thing to live by. The Dalai Lama is a very spiritual and powerful character in history, and he made a lot of changes in many lives, not only in Tibet, but also in the whole entire world.